Let's do a quick wrap up and tie up some loose ends on some miscellaneous questions that often arise. And so first, I want to talk about the math versus the theory. And I think I've said this before, but the math is always, the stats part, the numbers, are agnostic to the theory behind what we're studying, the causal flow, the what comes first and next in our model, and this includes, oh, and it's also agnostic to any practical implications that flow from that, obviously. But what we designate as the IV and the moderator does not matter for math purposes whatsoever. It will come out exactly the same. The moderation, the nature of that moderation does not change. It's sitting there in the data, and it will be discovered regardless of which way we do it. However, practically speaking, and for making decisions about people, which levers to pull in terms of if we have an intervention, whether it's a clinical or an IO, if we are manipulating some kind of IV or presentation of something to someone, and then we're recording their response, that is a causal relationship, and that always has to sit on the IV and the DV path. And if there is any causal relationship, it has to be the IV and the DV. That's where that causal relationship goes. Now, if it's both the IV and the moderator that are causing the DV, it's okay. It doesn't matter which is which. In that case, I would say that that's only the case where we're manipulating both the IV and the moderator. So in that case, it doesn't really matter which one you put, except as it is consistent with your theory. But if only one of those relationship is causal, either the IV and the DV or the moderator and the DV, whichever causal one that is, we have to put that in the IV spot, because that IV and DV has to be the causal link. And anything that is not causal, that is just observed, for example, if we're doing a manipulation, that always has to be the IV, just one manipulation. So we're doing an intervention of some kind, and we think that will vary by gender. The effectiveness of that intervention will vary by gender. Gender has to be the moderator. If we think that the intervention's effectiveness will vary by personality, personality always has to be the moderator, because that moderator is for individual differences that were present prior to any kind of intervention, assigning people to it, all of that. All right. So that's just how it works. And the inferences we draw it does matter what we designate as the IV and DV. And for more information on specifying IVs versus moderators, I've put some sources for the very nerdiest among us in the notes below the slide. Second, a common question comes up: do I need to test for type 2 heteroscedasticity in the case of two continuous predictors interacting? And the answer is no. Type 2 is only for the case where one of those variables involved in the moderation is categorical. So let's review. If you have a categorical control variable, that one you'd want to do a quick Levene's test on to see about homogeneity of variances. If you had two continuous predictors, like the example we just did this week, we would want to test for type 1 heteroscedasticity, look at it, see it, visualize it, and if it looks like it's a problem, just use the HC4 correction. I think that also is a great way to control for, or I'm sorry, to correct for type 1 heteroscedasticity at the time of this recording, at least. At this point, the experts seem to say that that is a good thing to do. So remember, it's the JTools package, and I went over that actually in a prior last week's lecture. So it's in the R code from last week. And one more thing I wanted to go over, I forgot to mention last week, failed to mention, that I put some reference material into the R code that accompanied last week's lecture. It's a mystery code. You probably saw it for reference only. Computing the score test. And we have a Brosh Pagan that's much easier, that BP command from one of the packages, which escapes me now. But I just wanted to put this in here in case you wanted to know about another way to do it. This is score test uses a chi-square instead, and it's more complicated to calculate, and I went through all the steps. It's just for reference, okay? So you don't need to know it for any exams in this class. It's just extra, and I debated whether to put in here, but it's clearly labeled, so Don't worry about that. You have to run several equations to be able to get all of the different numbers to put into an equation, and then it spits out a chi-square number, and you have to take that and put it into a calculator online with the DF, and then it tells you. And if it's significant, then you have type 2 heteroscedasticity. You have that issue. So I wish there was... this is where my knowledge is getting fuzzy, quite honestly. But if there's a way like this to test for type 1 heteroscedasticity, and just a quick side trail here, and the answer to that is I'm not sure yet. I think that there might be some things out there, but if you're visualizing the data and it just looks funny to you in terms of just visually, then you can always use that corrected and just tell the reader or the audience that you use the corrected. What I do in that case, honestly, when things look funny like that, is I run it both with the corrected and uncorrected, and a lot of times it just doesn't change. But some cases it might, and that's important to catch. But a lot of times it doesn't change, and so you can honestly tell your audience, look, I ran it both ways. I did the HC4 correction, and it didn't change the final result. Now, finally, plotting the nature of the moderation is going to be different. Now, we plotted for the categorical, let me pull this up here. For the categorical moderator, we plotted the simple slopes, the relationship between IV and DV, remember extroversion and performance, across the 3 departments. And that is, I think, simpler to understand sometimes than the reverse case. And the reverse, I mean that you reverse the IV and the moderator, such that the IV is categorical. This would be all cases where we have a manipulation, and we are expecting that an individual difference variable, as we talked about before, is going to be the moderator, and that is a continuous one. So something like a person's personality or some kind of characteristic, a skill that they have. And we believe that they're going to respond differently to the manipulation based on the level of that skill. Okay, so in that case, we would want to go back here and plot the simple slopes, quote unquote, differently. So we would do a bar graph instead, because, and I've seen people violate this rule, but I don't like to violate it, where the IV is always on the x-axis and the outcome is always on the DV. So I've seen before, like the moderator is here and it's confusing. So I highly recommend, when the IV is categorical and you have condition 1 here, maybe this is the control group, and condition 2, this is, the experimental group, whatever. And then we expect that at low levels of the moderator, we're going to see these are the blue bars representing that, and then at high levels are the green bars. And so we can see that there's probably a main effect for this, for the IV, meaning that the experimental condition produces more, both high and low levels of the moderator experience. It yields more of the outcome, whatever that is. But we don't expect to see the same difference at the high and low levels. So this difference is fairly small in the placebo group, control group, and then it's wider. That gap is widening in the experimental condition. So you can think of examples in your field where you might see this. Again, it's going to be probably a manipulation of some kind where you have controller intervention, or intervention 1 and intervention 2, 2 kinds of interventions you're comparing to one another, and you expect that there's an individual difference variable that will cause the IV to be more effective, the intervention, I should say, to be more effective for some people than others. And so this is the way you graph it. We would not do it in this way that I showed you here in the example where we have the moderator that's categorical. So hopefully this is helpful for thinking about dissertation or other studies that you're planning to conduct. And that's all I had to say. This is officially the end of our content coverage of moderation. So let's move on to the review now.